Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I wanted to cover a topic which I've been thinking about recently because I've been listening to a few podcasts on the Beatles, and a few people seem to they speculate about things which might have happened differently in the Beatles' career or choices which might have been made, and they're kind of reading things into lyrics to suit their own theories, I suppose. And this brought me to the question, how well do we know our heroes? You know, we listen to their music, we have all their records, but do we actually know them as people? And I remember John Lennon in the Lennon Remembers interview saying he got pissed off because he said his fans live vicariously through me, and they don't lead their own lives. They're trying to copy me or follow me and read things into my life which were never there, and all the rest of it. And then I was listening to a Fabcast, the Fabcast podcast, and they were making the point: are we owed anything by our heroes? You know, if we see Paul McCartney in a restaurant, are we entitled to go up to him and say, in the middle of his meal, can we have your autograph? And they emphatically say no, and that's quite right, because these artists are human beings and they're entitled to their privacy. And just because we buy all their records, as Ringo said, because I don't go up to Mr. Mother's Pride door and say, I bought your loaf, I own you. These people like privacy, and obviously that kind of fan sort of stalking aspect is taken to its extreme with the jerk of all jerks and what he did to John Lennon in 1980, and also the nutter who stabbed George Harrison in his own home in 1999. I mean, this is just, who'd be a Beatle, who'd be a rock star, and particularly who'd be a Beatle when 50% of them, well, one of them was killed and one of them was damn nearly killed. It's just tragic. And there's another podcast I was listening to called Another Kind of Mind, and I was quite intrigued by this because they had a 3-part thing called Pizzas and Fairy Tales, and they were supposed to be covering John and Paul's relationship, and I listened to part 1 hour and 40 minutes, and they seemed to spend most of the time discussing or arguing that John was bisexual, and that John and Paul was a kind of unrequited love affair, and they were very anti-Yoko. They, quotes like "nobody likes her anyway," very pro May Pang, and saying her book was an important historical document. Well, yeah, maybe it is, but then it's only one side of the story. And they were arguing that John and Yoko were sexually incompatible around the time when John went off with May. Well, I would say the reason that John and Yoko had problems in their marriage is probably primarily triggered by John's infidelity at that election night party in 1972. Can you think of a bigger reason why Yoko would be pissed off and want to have a period apart than that? They do mention that, but it's not dwelled upon. People are always, that podcast and other podcasts, endlessly speculating, what if John had not gone back to Yoko? Well, he did, and that led to Sean, and that led to the 5 years of baking bread and all the rest of it. And we can't change history. Why should we want to change history? It's what happened, and I think it's a little presumptuous to say, oh, if he'd done this, if John had stayed with May, he would have gone to New Orleans to meet Paul McCartney and recorded with him. Possibly, but maybe one can't discount the possibility that it would have been a crushing disappointment. I mean, think what the expectations would have been for John and Paul to record together after 5 years of being apart. And, you have Abbey Road as the last recorded statement from the Beatles. That's a lot to live up to. So who's to say it would have been a crowning glory of their time together? I'm not sure. Even Linda kind of sort of jumped on the fan bandwagon by saying they could have helped each other so much, talking about in the 70s. But what she fails to say also, well, I'm sure she realised, is the split led to the freedom for all of them to express themselves as solo artists. and to do things which perhaps would not have been encouraged within the group format. And I don't buy this Genesis formula about, let's record an album together and then let's do a few solo albums and then come back together. And I think, if you're going to split, make a clean thing of it and move on. And they're the only known popular group has actually quit when they were on top, that I can think of. So, it's all well and interesting to listen to May Pang or Fred Seaman or Jack Douglas, but bear in mind it's only one side of the story, and John is not here to defend himself anymore, hasn't been for 43 years. Yoko is maintaining a dignified silence as always. I mean, Jack Douglas is saying John would have got together with Paul in 81, as if it's kind of a fact. I mean, but Paul, because John was going to record with Ringo and Paul was going to join them. Well, Paul had already recorded his contribution to Stop and Smell the Roses in August of 1980 with the tracks Attention and Private Property and Sure to Fall in Love with You. So I think it's more likely that John would have joined Ringo, but his contribution would have been separate, as it had been on Roger Graveur and the Ringo album. The Sunday Times the other month was, they were speculating when they were reviewing Now and Then, would the Beatles have got back together if John hadn't died? And they said the answer, probably in the 1980s. Well, what's that based on? I think it goes completely against what John was saying around about the time he was dying, and the fact that they'd had the good sense not to reform up until that point. Fabcast podcast also convinced John and Paul would have got together in 81. Primarily, it seems based on the fact that John loved the Coming Up single. Well, I know he liked it, but he wasn't absolutely raving about it, and it wasn't the only reason he went back into the studio. I mean, they make a bit too much of a big thing of that. Another Kind of Mind podcast, and they're not alone here, think that I know the track from Mind Games is about Paul, based on the fact that run-of-the-mill phrases or words like getting better and yesterday and I love you more are in the lyric. And to me, there's no evidence at all that it's about Paul. It's quite obviously a love song about Yoko, but they think because it's got those phrases in the song, it must be about Paul. The same with the track from Bound on the Run, no words, even though Denny wrote the verse. And I think Paul's contribution was the Sweet Burning Love. You cannot hide your burning love. That bit was Paul's bit. But at the end of the verse, it's only me, I love you. Because it says it's only me, they think it's about John, because when John and Paul were having a row in '68, John lowered his glasses and said to Paul, it's only me. And then put his glasses back up and they started arguing again. I don't think he said I love you. It was just added. But anyway, I don't think No Words is about John at all. So back to the point, if they, the fact that they split up gave them artistic freedom to record things like Cold Turkey. Can you imagine that being a Beatles song? It was offered to them and they refused it. Or the whole of the Mother Plastic Ono Band album is a little bit too nitty-gritty personal to imagine as a Beatles albums, in the same way that George's religious stuff probably would have been nixed by the other two had he presented that kind of, well, he did try and present some of it, but can you really imagine tracks like My Sweet Lord as a Beatles song, or even Another Day, or Mull of Kintyre, or Pipes of Peace? I think they're glorious as solo, shining examples of solo success for the ex-Beatles. So in conclusion, remember Jack Douglas saying those people who thought they knew John because of his music, well, they did, because 80% of himself was expressed in his music. Well, I think he's got a point, because we did know a side of John, but it was only one side of it, and I don't think his personal life we were qualified. Well, maybe Jack Douglas obviously knows more than we do, but I don't think we're qualified to speculate on that. Apart from the fact it's none of my business, and it's all speculation. He's been gone 43 years. So I think the lesson I've learnt from all of this is don't be judgmental. And, there are times when I've been resentful of the Beatles for certain things they've done, like George being too ungrateful to Paul over the years, or Paul not varying his set lists on tour, or Ringo refusing to sign autographs. Well, it's up to them. It's their lives, and they're in the spotlight. They're having to endure the pain of being famous. As George said, the people gave their money and we gave our nervous systems. And then John ended up getting killed, and George very nearly. So I say live and let live. Love the music, yes, but don't project your own ideals, or I won't project my own ideals or fantasies onto them, and think that I know better what would have been, how things would have gone if certain choices had been made differently. If John really did have the choice of A, staying with May and going to play with Paul in New Orleans, or B, going back to Yoko and having Sean and spending 5 years with him growing up, well, that was his choice and he made it. And who's to say that he didn't make the right choice? Personally, I think John went off the idea of working with Paul. After all, in 10 years, he never guested on a Paul or George album, and I don't think there was any reason for him to do so. I mean, do you miss Paul McCartney on the Imagine album? No. Do you miss Paul McCartney on All Things Must Pass? No. And I can't really imagine John playing on Venus and Mars anyway, if I'm honest. So anyway, that was me sort of having a bit of a rant and complaining about some of the people who seem to think they know the ex-Beatles because of, reading stuff into their lyrics and to suit their own agenda, which is fine. It's a free world, you can do that, but I think it's a bit presumptuous, and I prefer to just stick to the music and let them lead their own lives in the privacy of their own homes, etc. Thank you for watching. See you next time.